everybody. I don't know about you, but I remember the launch of the original 981 generation Porsche Cayman GT4 very vividly. This was a big deal because at long last the company relented and built the car that we all wanted them to, but they always said they were never going to. Finally, here was a Cayman given its full potential, and that car was an instant hit. So, naturally, expectations for its successor were sky high. Yet, a few things happened that have meant that even now, only shortly after that car has been discontinued, it feels like it's already been somewhat forgotten. And I think Porsche made a few fundamental errors with the 718 Cayman GT4. But I can't really damn the thing if I haven't driven it. And though I've driven many of the cars very close to it, including the 718 Spyder, effectively the convertible version of the same thing, and the mighty 718 GT4 RS, I haven't yet actually sampled the 718 GT4 full stop. Today, courtesy of a lovely chap called Jim, I am finally able to right that wrong. I'm going to be driving this car, telling you what it's like, and also explaining just how I think Porsche got it quite so badly wrong. To understand what it is that happened, we must first understand what a Cayman GT4 is. I am fairly confident you're already familiar with the Cayman, Porsche's mid-engined entry-level sports car, the hardtop version of the Boxster, which we've had in some shape or form since 1997. The Cayman then joined the Boxster for its second generation, arriving in the middle of the 2000s. It was, like the Boxster before it, another instant hit because it gave people much of what they loved about the Porsche brand: handsome, if perhaps not beautiful styling, though I have always had a bit of a thing for the first generation Cayman. You had that classic flat-six engine, but unlike the 911, which is famously rear-engined, this, like the Boxster, was mid-engined. So just about any and every journalist that drove it said that actually, when it came down to it, this was a better balanced car and maybe a more enjoyable drive than its iconic older brother. It is then possibly because of this very fact that Porsche were always a little bit wary of giving it anything more than modest amounts of power. So at any and all points during the Cayman's life, it felt like it was being deliberately held back, because everybody knew if it had the same power as a 911, it would easily outperform it. Which is why then, when Porsche finally did relent and build the car we'd all been waiting for, the Cayman GT4, it was such a big deal. It took them until 2015 to do it, by which time the car was in its third generation. Well, third for the Boxster anyway, the one dubbed 981. And the formula was fairly simple. They took the already brilliant Cayman, they gave it a detuned version of the Carrera S's engine, making just shy of 400 horsepower, and they took effectively the front end of a 911 GT3. So it received a radically different setup for the suspension, the brakes, and various other components, giving you all round a sharper, tauter, and faster car. It was brilliant. But unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on your perspective, everybody knew that. And because circumstances at the time conspired to produce a perfect storm, the Cayman GT4 became one of the prime examples of a Porsche where people went mad for them and were desperate to pay overs for what previously would have been a relatively ordinary car. Very quickly, vehicles that had carried a list price of some £85,000 to £90,000, people began asking 100, 105, 115, 130. I even saw a few advertised for over £150,000. And the GT4 I certainly don't think created this scenario, because it really had been brewing in the Porsche world for quite some time. But it was certainly one of the first cars I remember seeing and being annoyed about it, because had that not happened, I might actually have been able to afford one. And I think one of the reasons that it was for such a long time such a sought-after car is because it was relatively limited. Never to specific numbers or anything like that, but the simple fact is they didn't build it for all that long. The car was in production for just over a year, until the 981 as a whole was discontinued, being replaced by the 718. And when that happened, Porsche got really controversial, because out went the iconic naturally aspirated flat 6, and in came a series of still flat but now 4-cylinder turbo engines. Cue lots of unfavourable comparisons with Subarus, and though sure the cars did bring with them inevitable improvements in both pace and economy, this wasn't the engine that people had fallen in love with. So when it was invariably announced that there was going to be a second GT4, people got asking, what engine are they going to put in it? The answer actually shocked everybody, because Porsche went and built a whole new lump seemingly just for this. It displaces 4 litres, it makes 420 horsepower, 310 pounds-feet of torque, that's 420 Nm, and it is actually a heavy reworking of the 3-litre twin-turbo that you would have found in a Carrera, but here stripped of its forced induction. And we were all shocked, because that made it very apparent that Porsche were taking this car really rather seriously. Okay, it's still not a true GT engine. For that, we had to wait until the GT4 RS, when they finally stuck that manic 500 horsepower lump into a Cayman. And I have driven that car. And to be honest with you, I have a love-hate relationship with that engine, because when it's on song, it is utterly and totally beguiling. The rest of the time, it's just frustrating. On the road, I think this is far better. Pulls hard from low down. I mean, I'm in 5th gear at 2000 RPM, but you put your boot in and it responds. Makes a darn good noise too, even though these cars naturally were never going to be as raucous as their forebears, on account of the fact that they had to meet ever-tightening emissions regs, so they were quieter, fitted with particulate filters and the like. It still sounds pretty darn good. Sure, you won't hear it from a mile away, but when it goes past, you know it's something special, and in here, though I've no doubt there's a little bit of assistance, still makes a good sound. The car overall also still has all of the hallmarks that made any and every Cayman brilliant. First off, it's a good-looking thing. This generation of GT4 is sharpened compared with the outgoing one, a little more aggressive in the aero department, but still not daft. For my money, it gives you the exact right amount of road racer vibes. I love it. That rear wing, in fact, even gives me hints of 996 GT2. And it just so happens that this afternoon I am driving a 996 GT2. But I wager, across country, this is probably the faster car. Curiously, it's not actually anywhere near as light as its forebear. This, all in, depending on specification, weighs around 1,470 kilos. And the older 981, again, depending on specification, could have been anywhere up to about 100 kilos lighter. Still, you wouldn't call it a shy performer, this. And this particular example, I think, is a very, very interesting one that Jim has brought me. He has previously had a couple of Boxsters and found himself wanting something a little more special. This was at a dealership local to him, and he'd been eyeing it up for quite some time. He'd always fancied the idea of a Cayman GT4, specifically wanted one with a manual. One big difference between this and the 981 is that later during the model's life they did introduce PDK for this, but of course the driver's choice is always going to be the manual, and it's a wonderful box. Nice, short throw, beautiful action. You can rev match, heel and toe. It's all set up absolutely perfectly, as you would expect in any Porsche. And what drew him to this car particularly wasn't just the fact it's a gorgeous Cayman GT4 in Guards Red, but the fact that it was a 2.5-year-old car with just 1,500 miles on the clock. Today, it has just over 12,500, so I can't say that he hasn't enjoyed it, but he has still kept it in very, very good nick. It's not a car that really appears to have much at all in the way of options. There's no extended leather, there's no bucket seats or anything like that. But actually, in a lot of ways, this car demonstrates that you don't necessarily need all of that. I seem to recall that these seats may be a bit like in the GT3s. Though they are the comfort option, they still aren't what you might term regular comfort seats. They're quite nicely sculpted and actually do an excellent job of holding you in place. How's the turning circle? Because I'm sure you're all keen to know about that. It's pretty good, yeah. In typical Porsche fashion, the thing is ludicrously long-geared, so even in second you can break the national speed limit on a motorway. And that's a bit of a shame, really. Now, the truth is that when you drive it, it doesn't feel like it is overly long-geared, simply because it can pull from so low down. And I expect part of the reason for this was to try and make sure that the car would perform well on circuit, specifically a very well-known and rather long one in the northwestern part of Germany. It is also in situations like this where some of the other regular Cayman traits shine through. It is still a fairly narrow car. You've got excellent visibility out of the front. Those wonderfully sharp haunches are absolutely beautiful to look at and also help you place the car well. Between them, up at the front, you'll also find a generously sized boot, and of course, as is Cayman and Boxster tradition, you've also got another one at the back, meaning if you want to do a nice cross-country journey, this is an excellent companion. Around town, like its GT3 cousins, the ride is on the firm side, though it hasn't thus far ever been crashy, but it is a little harder than you might like it to be. I recall going out in the 718 Spyder and feeling that was a car that was very much on the edge of what I would term acceptable for a road car. You could naturally have these cars optioned in all sorts of different ways, and though I would say that if you put the bucket seats in, the extended leather, maybe the carbon ceramics, the car would look and feel a little more special. Even as we have it here, it is a wonderful thing and doesn't really feel like it falls short in any particular way. The brakes, for example, though sure, yeah, the ceramics would ultimately be better, these are still excellent. I also love the beautiful simplicity of this interior. For me, it is miles better than that you would find in the current day 992 Generation 911. You've got a screen over here which, alright, by today's standards is beginning to look a little quaint on account of how small it is, but it gives you most of what you would want, with the exception of Android Auto. You do though still have physical controls for your HVAC, which is nice, and up front you've got a trio of gauges, two of which are analog for your speed and your revs, and then on the right a customizable one giving you all sorts of different information. Got your audio settings, your mobile phone things, trip computer, tire pressures, etc, etc, etc. And so, like its predecessor, this car has all of the things it needs to be an absolutely excellent road car. But is it? Time to put it through my favourite little bit of B-road, and I'll report back in about 30 seconds time. Yep, no other way of saying it, this car is fabulous. I love it. And you know what it's really reminding me of? That first generation 996 GT3 that I drove. This actually has a fair bit more punch. but it's an engine that you can drive either off of the torque or using the revs and the top-end power. And both ways, it delivers. It is also a car where you can simply cruise, but use the steering, the handling, and the wonderfully communicative chassis to just guide you through the bends. If it has a weakness, it is the steering. And it's not bad, but this electrically assisted rack, well, it's just not as good as those of old. But if I'm being fair to it, it is still better than a great many others I've driven, including in things that cost a lot more that should really be even better. And at no point have I been in any doubt whatsoever as to the car's capabilities. Again, like in that GT3, it's not a hypersensitive rack, but the steering does have a nice weighting about it, it moves in your hand a fair amount, and it really does communicate to you. Okay, not as vividly as before, but it still does it. And the joy of this is it's giving me all of the sensations that the 992 GT3 doesn't. That is ludicrously, devastatingly fast. It's an incredible car. But to try and get the most of it, you have to be doing a speed that is simply put irresponsible. This you can have plenty of fun in without really even having to bother the speed limit. I love it. One of my few complaints really is that with that long gearing, I just don't get to hear the engine at the top end of its rev range anywhere near enough. Add in the practicality and the packaging of any and every Cayman, that Porsche reliability, and really, you've got a winner here. So, why is it that I started this video by doing a bit of complaining and saying that Porsche really cocked it up? Well, that's because it wasn't Porsche that got the car wrong. It wasn't Andreas Preuninger who made a mistake. Instead, it was the Porsche dealers. Because you remember I said that first generation GT4, that was a reasonably limited car and people went a bit mad with it. Well, as soon as this one was announced, everybody thought that the same thing was going to happen. And so you knew full well that a lot of the people putting their orders in early, and more importantly, those getting them, were the ones that were particularly buddy-buddy with their dealer, and ones that had come to an arrangement meaning that they were going to get preferential treatment. These were the people that then listed their nice new Cayman GT4 they said they really wanted with 100 miles on the clock. And that, to me, is not right. But you see, for those people, things didn't go so well because this car wasn't in production for a year. This car was in production for nearly 4. And though in that time there were some fairly troubling years, which in a lot of ways did something to help keep prices buoyant, the fact is, this is a far, far more common car. The original 981 GT4, today on Auto Trader, there are 30 examples for sale. But of this generation, there are 34 GT4 RS. This one, the plain old 718 GT4, there are 90 for sale. And it became very clear, particularly in sort of 2023, as the model was coming to its end and certain situations were sorting themselves out, that if you actually wanted to buy one of these, you could have simply walked into your dealer, ordered it, and got it. And I do feel a bit aggrieved about that because had in the early days Porsche said, you know what, if you want a Cayman GT4, you can have one, everyone can have one, but it's going to be about 2 years, the speculators wouldn't have been interested. Instead, all of the people that actually want to drive one would have been able to have afforded one at list price. And because we didn't think that ever was going to be a possibility, we went off and bought other things. The Lotus Emira, I think, managed to collect quite a few people that were originally going to buy a Cayman GT4. And this really, to me, is a masterclass in mismanagement of customer expectations. I think the Porsche dealers knew full well just how many of these were going to be, but as long as customers didn't realise how common they were going to be, then they didn't know that they didn't have to play the silly game that they've been doing for a few years. It's really, really rather unfortunate. And I think a similar thing, perhaps to an even more extreme extent, has happened with the GT4 RS. I've heard rumours that over the last few months, if you'd actually wanted an RS, you basically could have had one. But in the early days, people were asking £250,000 for a £150,000 car. And that's just greed. And though I'm not so naive to think that the world will ever be without greed, to me, the whole point of a Porsche has always been that it's the car that, unlike a Ferrari, you can simply just walk into a dealer, pay your money for, get and enjoy. You shouldn't have to run around in circles, jump through hoops, or do anything else to get one. And as it turns out, you didn't. But because we believed you did, people didn't bother. But there is a good side to this, you see, because where the early Cayman GT4 now commands, at its lowest, say, 55 to 60,000 pounds, these begin at just about 65 to 70,000. Granted, they will be for lower specification cars or ones with higher mileage on, but just about any and every 718 GT4 is going to be a very, very good car. And at that money, I would really struggle to think of an alternative. Jim is considering moving this on. He's thinking of moving into an Emira because to his eyes, it is the far prettier car. It's also rarer, more interesting, a little bit special, and he likes that sort of thing. And though I've said to him, look, it's a very, very good car, the Emira, I think it's a bit of a sideways move. And I've been trying to think of what maybe to suggest to him instead, but I'm coming up a little bit short. I said about maybe an Aston Martin, but that doesn't appeal to him. An older Ferrari, really, compared to one of these, is going to be a gamble to run. This wager wouldn't really cause much grief at all for its owner. This one's given him a couple of small issues, but they've all been sorted by the dealer and under warranty, so that's not a concern. And the only other thing I can really think of as a suggestion is an old first generation Audi R8 V10, because there he can have his, well, not sports, but supercar with a manual and an even mightier engine. As this is a high days and holidays thing for him, but he tries to have as many high days and holidays as he can, I think that's a car that might manage to achieve that feeling of being even more special. And as he doesn't need the practicality this offers, the compromised storage of an R8 isn't going to be as much of an issue. But I tell you something, if for a little while now you've been looking at old 911 GT3s, 996s, 997s and the like, or even maybe newer 911 GTS, Carrera S, that sort of thing, and you haven't considered one of these, you really should. Because though it may have been the victim of a lot of tomfoolery at certain dealers, there isn't really anything that can take away from it just how fundamentally brilliant the 718 GT4 is. Does it go across the road like a Lotus? No, not quite. Does it steer with the beauty and the precision of an old GT3? No, not quite. Does it have the manic engine of one of those either? No, not quite. But trust me, this has more than enough in every department to satisfy, I think, even the most discerning of petrol heads. Glad I finally got to drive it. So, I want to say a big thank you to Jim for bringing it out, and as ever, to you for watching. Don't forget to hit the like button, comment down below, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you for the next one. Bye-bye.